very glad to see those of you who came the first time, came back, and I think we've got interesting and exciting material. I am Laura Post. I'm a consultant with VO Partners, and I'm just going to do a little bit of the introduction material, then turn it over to Ann Urashek, our principal and managing partner. So just a few of the technicalities. If you have any questions during the session and something's not working, you can email Melissa, who is on the screen. Melissa Harris is there, she's waving, at fiopartners.com, or you can email me at laura@fiopartners.com. We are going to record this, and it'll be available after the session for those of you who choose to stay for the informal conversation. We actually, at the end, we will take that out of the final recording, so don't worry about that. We're going to use the chat box. We're going to have some, we try to make it as interactive as possible in a big session, so we are going to open up the chat box, and actually would suggest that if you go to the top right of your screen and you shift to speaker view, and then open your chat box, then you'll be able to play along, and we hope you will participate. We know it takes a few minutes for people to, when we ask you questions, to think about it, but we'd love to hear from you as we're going along, and love for you to hear from each other, because we do believe that part of the power of this is to create a community among you. So again, just we hope you enjoy and chip in as we go along. So Ann, I'm gonna turn it over to you.
Great. Thanks so much, Laura, for that welcome, and really so nice to see so many faces with us this afternoon. Today is session 2, Retrenchment 101, Strategies to Survive and Thrive. So really excited to share with you some content to really continue our conversation that we kicked off on Tuesday. For those of you who don't know, VO Partners is a consulting firm that's based here in Connecticut, with offices also in Rhode Island, but we do work around the country. Our tagline is, we help leaders make better decisions. We often see ourselves as a real trusted advisor and partner to our clients, and really navigating strategic decisions. And I think in so many ways, the crisis has created so many decisions for you to make that we were really motivated to bring this series together to support each of you in the decisions that lie ahead. So where are we in the series? This past Tuesday, we kicked off the series with really leaning into understanding decision-making. How do our brains work? How do our brains work in a crisis? And what does that tell us as leaders about what we need to be thinking about, what we need to be concerned about, and really guidance around what's the process that we should be undertaking to really, in some ways, begin to think beyond the crisis, really thinking beyond triage. Where we're headed. So today is about Retrenchment 101. So much of what we talked about on Tuesday was around what's the information that we need to support decision making. And I think in a lot of ways, today is the beginning of that conversation. It's really, what is the information that you need, that your board needs, to really think about where are you as an organization, how has the crisis impacted you, and what's your path forward. We're going to build on information raising on Tuesday when we lean into scenario planning, and then we'll head into what I think is really exciting choice making, thinking about innovation and disruption next Thursday, leaning into our relationships in the third week in terms of the relationships between our board and CEO, as well as creating strategic alliances. So we hope you'll continue to plug into the topics that really resonate most with you. As Laura said, my name is Ann Urashek, and I have been the principal here at VO Partners for the last 13 years, and it's an absolute pleasure to be with you. And this really, as Laura said, is about us providing you some content, but more so also about you getting to know each other and really strengthening a peer-to-peer community of leaders. So I've introduced myself. I really want you all to jump into the chat box and share with us your name, organization, and where you're based. It'd be great to see what organizations are represented with us today. I know we've got some familiar faces and new faces, and so I'm just happy to see all of you plugged in and taking the time to both learn and be in community together. It's great. Awesome. So as we're kind of introducing ourselves in the chat box, you know, and as we go through the content today, I'm going to be prompting you throughout the presentation to kind of share your experiences. This is as much as it is about listening as it is about engaging. And so I'd like to share a little bit about what I'm hoping to cover with you today. This is really about understanding risk. Over the last 6 weeks, each of you has really been faced with so many decisions. And one of the things that we're starting to realize is that we moved really quickly early on in the crisis. And now we're really thinking about the future, as we really can see for so many of us and many communities, this is not going away fast. This is not a problem that's going to end tomorrow. So we really need to be thinking beyond the next 2 weeks. It's what are the next 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, and even year begin to look like. And I think what we want to help you with as leaders today is really thinking about risk. And so we're going to walk you through a risk assessment tool and really talk about what is the core of your organization. We need to try to help you understand where are you from an organizational health perspective in so many ways to figure out what is your path forward, what are your options as an organization as you're thinking about the implications of the crisis. And so we're going to kick it off with a little bit of an exploration of how really has our context changed? How has the crisis changed the context for your decision making as a leader? We're then going to lean into the assessment tool itself, and I'm going to try not to, sort of bore you too much with that, but I really want to give you some tools to think about how do I actually know how we're doing as an organization and what do I need to be thinking about? We'll close out with a conversation that's really about what's the core of your organization? What is the core set of programs and services that as you think ahead to the future really need to be protected, cultivated, and built on as you look to the future? So today is recognizing that for some organizations, the crisis is going to cause you to have to shrink. And how do you actually shrink strategically in a way that you can potentially become a little smaller, but then in fact grow from that potentially smaller core? So that's a lot what today is about. So we've got great representation in the chat. We've got Connie from Connecticut. Nice to see you, Connie. Thanks for plugging in. Venton from the Pillar Community Development Corporation. Carol's checking in from Canada, which is great. Shelly from Connecticut Main Street Center. Hey, Mayor, nice to see you. So thanks to all of you that have really chosen to plug in today. This is about the richness of the representation that we have today, and I'm excited for you to learn from each other, which is great. So let's start to get into this. So in terms of context, if you had said to me earlier this year or even in December and said, how much is the nonprofit sector under duress? And I would say something along the lines of, well, sort of depends on what part of the sector you're in. It depends on how dependent your organization might be on state government contracts and how risky that may look these days, or really sort of shifts in federal funding. But in many ways, the environment we were in prior to the crisis did have a pretty fairly high degree of predictability in some cases. As a leader, we may be seeing kind of low to moderate uncertainty. We were thinking about a lot of the opportunities that lied ahead for our organizations. And for some of you on the line today, if I had said to you, is your organization under threat? You would have probably said, no, we're in pretty good shape. I pretty much understand the industry I'm in. I understand my funding sources. We may be pivoting a little bit as we look ahead, but I'm not really envisioning major change. But with the crisis, things have substantively changed faster than I think any one of us could have expected. So we've gone to an environment of incredibly high uncertainty. We've moved to a place where opportunities that we would have said were on the horizon feel much farther away and potentially not even possible. And in addition to that, we talked a lot about this on Tuesday, there is this degree of threat that we have shifted for so many organizations to questions about, will we be able to continue? That the environment has become so threatening to our work that we are deeply considering what is our future and what is the future of our mission. And so what does that do for us as leaders, right? So if this is how the external context is changing around us, how is this changing in terms of our leadership perspectives? So I want you to think about this as I kind of go through this and jump into the chat, because I'm really curious, even from your perspective, how has your perspective as a leader already shifted? So if we do a couple of examples, let me kind of walk through these. If we think about in so many ways that we moved from opportunities for growth to what is really, can I maintain the status quo? Can I deliver my programs and services in a new way and protect and maintain the revenue streams I have in place? But for some of you, it's from growth to actually managing either decline or shrinking, which is really challenging. We've been thinking about, in a really kind of less, in a more certain environment, we're thinking about means. How should our work potentially shift or change? Incremental changes in program or service delivery to really ends. You know, we had questions earlier this week that was, what is my mission in this new environment? Can I actually enact what we had originally intended to do, looking ahead to kind of the challenges in the environment and dealing with the implications of the virus? We're going from change due to internal to really change due to external response. This is about each of us being really forced by the environment to respond very quickly. When we've talked about strategic planning with clients, 6 months ago, 9 months ago, we were doing long range planning. We were looking to 3-year, 4-year, 5-year plans, even in some cases. You know, we're now talking about 6-month plans, 3-month plans. What does the next year look like? How can we plan in this crisis, and what's a reasonable time horizon? It's a much shorter increment than we've been dealing with historically. And in addition to this, as leaders, we were really making decisions about things that were lower stakes, manageable increments, both for us, for our staff, for our board. And now we are talking about really high stakes decisions. This is about the survival of our organizations. So I'm curious, for you as leaders, how has your perspective changed? Are you thinking about things differently? Do you find that you may still be kind of in triage and haven't gotten to this place yet? But jump into the chat and I'll loop back to this. But I want you to be thinking about, how has your perspective as a leader really even changed in the crisis? And so let's talk about the high level process. And we teed this up on Tuesday, but when we're thinking about decision making in the crisis, we've got to start out with an assessment of your organization. And that is where we're going to start our conversation today. It is about assessing the organization, and then it's really about assessing the environment. So this is a plug for Tuesday's session, which is really going to be about how is the environment changing around us, and what does that actually mean for our organization. From those two places and spaces, you really need to be able to think about how to engage your stakeholders to identify what your options are and make choices around what is your path forward. But today is about you. It's about really taking stock about your health as an organization and how the crisis has actually impacted you. All right, so let's get into the tool.
And do you want to, sorry to interrupt you, do you want to just pause and see, we haven't gotten any input, but I'm just wondering if anybody had any input on your prior questions about how the perspective has changed.
Yeah, and if people really don't want to use the chat and just want to unmute themselves, I'd love to hear your voices if we'd prefer that.
Yeah, that's fine. It's a manageable group.
Yeah. So anybody want to share sort of how your perspective as a leader has changed because of the crisis? Yep.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Elizabeth wrote that time horizons are different, which is very clear.
Absolutely. The speed of decision making, the real sort of pressure to make decisions. A lot of you have been living in that space over the last 4 or 5 weeks, for sure, without full information. Absolutely. Absolutely. And we talked a lot on Tuesday about what's the information that you should be leaning into. How do we ensure that the information that we're using is credible? Thinking about the values of the organization that endure even in a socially distanced world. Absolutely. And we're going to talk about that in terms of, as we think to the future, what stays the same. Purpose and strategic alliances. Connie, making sure clients do not make panic decision making. Absolutely. Thank you for that. And keeping clients safe in a small space. We're talking with many of our clients about workplace safety and strategies and how critical that is right now. Absolutely. Especially as we think about potential returns to work.
And Lisa contributed about volunteers and how they will engage going forward.
Absolutely. Kind of alignment with the global community. Absolutely. Great. Thank you for sharing. I think it's so important that each of you knows that you're not alone in this journey in facing the decisions that you are as leaders. And so let's keep the engagement going as we move forward through the content today. This is a slide of a polar bear. Yes, it is. It's a polar bear on an iceberg. And so, what I want us to be thinking about as we think about organizational health and we think about decision making is that the crisis is creating stress in our organizations, substantive, speedy decision making. You've had to make a lot of decisions over the last 5 or 6 weeks. My hope is for each of you, it's slowing down just a little bit. And that's really what we talked about on Tuesday, which was the need to begin to slow down to decide what is the path forward. Today, though, is a message about don't wait too long to decide. We've got to start having some of the harder conversations about how our organizations are doing today and really what the horizon looks like. And I think in some ways we need to use objective information and particularly financial information to begin that conversation. We often see nonprofits that in some ways avoid the more difficult conversations, that we don't bring CEOs and boards in alignment around the health of an organization and really how much risk the organization may be facing due to implications from the crisis. And so my message is that as things have potentially slowed down just a little bit, now is the time to really begin to have some of these what may be potentially harder conversations, but it's really about how objective can we be about how we're doing. So we're going to give some technology a try a little bit. And so I'm going to walk you through what's called the early warning signs assessment tool. And I'm going to actually upload it into the chat. We're going to give this a try and see if this works. And we're also going to email this out to everyone immediately following the webinar today. So just give me 1 second. Hey, Laura, can you do the upload perchance? I'm having a little trouble on mine.
I don't have it immediately accessible, so.
I will help with that.
Forward it to me, I will.
Yeah, I think I might be able to help. 1 second. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually ask Melissa to upload it into the chat. It's right in the Dropbox folder. And I'm going to keep us going. So the way the tool works, so I want you to think about corporate vulnerability. And I also want you to keep in mind and think a little bit about how many of you read, this is going to sound kind of funny, but like teen magazines that had quizzes in them that said, how were you doing? Were you a good friend, a not so good friend? So part of what we thought a lot about with this tool was, how can we help organizations think through the potential red flags in their financials to begin to really sort of say, how at risk are we as an organization? So I'm going to take this forward. So here's what the tool does. It basically looks at key financial indicators, and it really asks you to take a trend perspective when you're looking at your financials. In addition to that, what it asks you to do is take a look and determine the viability of the core of the organization after any potential revenue loss. And so what I'm going to talk you through is a little bit about what are the indicators included in the tool. And we actually are going to try to figure out how to get it to you, but we also will definitely email it after today's session. So let's talk about financial red flags. And so you can jump into the chat if you want to answer this question, but how many of you look at your financials year over year? So really try to look at the trends in your financials versus just the sort of this year's budget, last year's budget. So one of the things that we really encourage folks to begin to do, particularly around this, thanks, Melissa. So just so everybody knows, the tool's been uploaded into the chat, and we'll also send it out ahead of time after the session. So the tool really starts off with really looking at your financial metrics. And so what we want to be looking at is there a pattern of deficits? And with some of this analysis, I want you to be thinking about not only this year and understanding the impact, but as best you can start to use this tool in scenario planning, which we'll do next week as well. So today is about looking to say, well, what do these numbers look like today? We'll talk a lot next week about how to use this tool to actually drive potential scenarios that lie ahead for you. So we're going to be looking at it. Do you have a pattern of deficits? Is there kind of trends in net assets that you should be concerned about? Your defensive interval. So defensive interval is really about how much cash do you have on hand and how many months can you support operations into the future. And it is a bit of a red flag if it's really less than 3 to 4 months is sort of concerning. We want to be looking at your debt ratio as well as your revenue ratios. And so what the tool does is it actually gives you the tips on how to calculate each one of these if this is not something that you do on a regular basis. And what we really want to be looking for in the revenue ratios is declines in specific revenue streams. So if you've already heard from particular funders, particular grants, particular government contracts, that there's going to be a substantive change in revenue, even for this year, that can be included in the tool and in the analysis. We also look at a couple of other indicators, including accounts payable aging, and that's your ability to really pay off your bills in a timely way, a fundraising ratio, as well as management costs. And so when you go through these red flags, the question becomes is if you have more than 3 of these, the message to you as a leader and to your board is that this is one of those stop, slow down, and consider your position kind of moments. Now, we've been talking a lot internally about this tool and how it can be helpful. And one might say if you have only 1 or 2 red flags, even in this crisis, given the challenges in the environment, you should still be having in some ways these conversations about how viable are we as we look to the future. How much risk is in our current sort of financial position that we should be concerned about. And so again, this is really meant to give you a tool to have a conversation with a set of stakeholders about how you're doing. And so the key here, though, is if that you do have a number of red flags, what we want to be curious about is if we were smaller, could we survive? And we're going to talk about this. And so if you have a number of financial red flags, the tool is going to take you really to the next section, which is really what is the status of our programs and services? And when we talk about that, that's the core of your organization. And what we're trying to really figure out is that if you had to be smaller, if you had to in some ways adjust your programs and services for a period of time, is it actually a financially viable entity? And so you've got to do a bit of analysis. And we acknowledge in many ways the assessment is somewhat subjective, but it looks at a few different things. The first one is core viability. So even as you think about the crisis and the impact of the crisis on your programs and services, do you have stable funding for it? Can you really think that the funding would stay the same even in the crisis, or will there be changes? Is there still demand for your services? Interestingly enough, one of our clients who we talked with yesterday does mental health, and they're doing telemedicine, and they've pivoted, and their show rate has skyrocketed because people actually make it to their appointments. And that's a bright spot for them, which is really a revenue stream that in some way is secure even in the pandemic. So we have to think about market demand, and we also have to continue to think about, can we actually measure the outcomes of our work? That's core viability. We also need to think about market strength. So what does the competitive landscape look like for your programs and services? And in so many ways, is that something that you can maintain as you look ahead in the crisis? A couple of other elements related to the core speak to 2 things. One of them is coverage, and that's how unique are your programs and services. And so can you differentiate yourself in the market from others in the sense that do consumers or those who use your services have a lot of choices? And lastly, it's the cost of aggressive competition. So as the markets continue to change, do you have actual funding that you could use to compete for consumers in this environment? Now, what's important is that this is actually a tool that scores. And so at the end of it, it gives you some guidance. So you can score yourself, you can work with stakeholders to develop a score. And it's really about thinking, is it possible for us as an entity to be a smaller entity, but remain financially viable? If we're going to struggle, should we be considering a strategic alliance? Or lastly, if we are really going to struggle, should we actually be thinking about more of a partnership or potentially consolidating our organization with another? Now, I think what's hard about this is that you as a leader may not be in a place where you're like, I don't really want to talk to anyone about mergers. I've got to hunker down. I've got to do my thing. I've got to protect my clients and my programs and services. But that's where it comes back to the iceberg. Don't wait too long. So I really want you to kind of make sure that you're looking at your financials with eyes wide open, really pushing yourself to say, can we continue these programs and services into the future? Because it's that combination that's going to, in some ways, push you to kind of figure out what your path forward really is. So I just want to make sure everybody sort of has gotten the tool. It is about knowing what your options are. That's what this tool is about. It's about creating a base of information to better understand what are the options and choices that you have as an organization. So I've sort of laid these out visually here. And so if you take the tool and you really look at the data, and you're financially vulnerable, the first thing we have to really ask ourselves is, do we have a viable core? Is there a set of programs and services that can continue into the future? And if so, we need to be thinking about retrenchment, which is how do we actually protect what might be a smaller version of our organization? If you take the assessment and you're actually financially healthy, and you really feel as if you have very few flags, you're actually pretty stable in this crisis, one of the things we're really encouraging is for you to be thinking about potential alliances. There are smaller organizations that will not have the runway to survive the crisis. And as a stronger, more financially healthy entity, we're encouraging you to think about what are the partnerships that you could create in this environment that would protect programs and community-based services. And in addition to that, if you're like, I think we should have a partner, but I'm not really sure, I'm not even sure if we could have a partner, we're going to really explore that in session 6 of the series, which is how do I actually design a strategic alliance and how do I engage in that work? It's kind of a whole topic unto itself, and so we gave it its own session towards the end of next week. So before I move from the tool, I just want to sort of stop for a second and sort of see if people have questions. And I think in a lot of ways, the tool is really meant to be a discussion tool that you can use with leaders, both with your board and even your senior management team, to really assess where you are as an organization. And Mayor Schulman from the Hartford Foundation, if you're in their region, is encouraging me to let you know that the NSP really does offer grants. That's the Technical Assistance Program that's part of the Hartford Foundation, to really talk with them about consultants to support really the feasibility and implementation of alliances and mergers. Thanks for that, Mayor.
And maybe I'll just jump in with a question
Sure.
that might be on people's minds, which is if you're mid-year of a financial year, which I'm sure many people are, if you're going to use a tool like this, should you re-estimate your full year and use that for your 2020?
Absolutely. So you can basically do estimates using this tool. You can also run it historically. So the tool has you kind of looking at a moment in time, but you can also run these numbers at sort of 2 to 3 year trends using your audits. So we do actually try to have you think a little bit about what has been the multi-year trend on some of these data points. And then in some ways, as we talk next week, how do I actually start to build scenarios that would make sense? And so absolutely, Laura, I think you're going to end up needing to do some projections even for this year. But we'll tie this all together next Tuesday and sort of saying, how are these particular ratios going to be impacted under different scenarios? And we'll do a deep dive next week on that. Thanks for that.
You're welcome.
Other questions about the tool from the group? There's a lot there to chew on. Okay, so what I want to pivot to is really from the tool itself. This is really, in so many ways, if you find yourself financially vulnerable and you're really saying to yourself, I'm not really sure how small we can get to survive, what I want to talk with you now about, like, really what are some of your options? And so we're going to talk a little bit about this. So when we're thinking about the core, there's a number of options that emerge. And so if you think about an after-school program that has one program where we run an after-school program in multiple locations, we sort of have one model that we do in multiple places. The question becomes is, can that turn into an online format? What does the summer programming look like? Can we be just a smaller version of ourselves using a different delivery method? So that's really option one, that we would sort of keep everything, but we might do it differently, or we might do it smaller. So we may need fewer people to do it, but the core work of our organization is not going to change. In option two, we would really be thinking about what elements of our programs and services actually can adapt or be most innovative in this very uncertain environment? What are the adaptable programs and services that we have that could be run in different ways given the implications of the crisis? That's another way to think about shrinking and shrinking down to our core. We may also narrow the organization down to the 1, 2, or 3 programs that are most essential to the clients and consumers that we serve. As I think about some of the organizations that we're working with, they're making some hard choices about that. They're letting go of some programming. They're like, that one we can't do right now, and kind of focusing their energy on maintaining a smaller set of programs to really enact their mission. And the last option is option 4. And this is really about understanding funding. And so it's about saying, you know what, we do not have the cash reserves to carry programs where we're going to lose money. We are going to need to shrink down to the programs and services that we know actually have the funding to deliver them. And I think as I think about all of the options, they are all difficult in the sense of the implications for staff and board and some of the emotional content that goes with this decision making. But I think in so many ways, I want you to be thinking about that smaller has a lot of different, for you, could have a lot of different look and feels. It's not going to be the same for each of you as we think about retrenchment as a strategy. It's reminding ourselves in so many ways that if we think we want to survive this crisis as a standalone entity that is been some continuity to what it's been in the past, it's really how can we use the resources we have to extend our runway? And what does that need to look like? Is it a process of just shrinking and then growing? Is it a process of shrinking and then reinvention? For each of you, the answer really may be different, but I want you to recognize that there are a number of options to you as you think about how you may carve your own path forward. And so when we're thinking about the core and designing a new core, there are some characteristics and things to keep in mind. And so when we're thinking about the core and you're thinking about what really may be able to survive on the other side of the crisis, we do need to think first about the economics of service delivery if there are reduced budgets and reduced budgetary levels. And so if we're thinking about revenue implications, how does that affect staffing? How does that affect the actual delivery of services? Are there in some ways substantive implications for you if you reduce the level of services? So do you have partnerships that could be adversely affected? Are there government contracts in so many ways that you may need to renegotiate at this point, given the shifts and sort of changes we need to make to deal with the crisis? What's the relationship that you have with other organizations in the field? And also, are there emerging areas of high impact or potential? So I'm seeing so many organizations actually in the crisis see opportunities, see new problems that they could solve or new ways that they could deliver services. So we may be shrinking one part of our organization, but are there other places that are actually really exciting and really are showing impact and additional potential? And it also really is coming back to mission and coming back to values of the organization. One of the great conversations we've been having with leaders is really about what's your origin story? Why did you start? What was the problem that your organization was really created to solve? And in some ways going a bit back to basics, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that as well, but it's really what was the problem you were designed to solve and how has that problem changed or morphed because of the crisis? And so when we're thinking about the core, and this is part of the decision making as leaders in partnership with your board and your potentially senior staff, is what's our continuity with history versus how adaptable and nimble can we be? And so when I think about continuity with history, there are organizations that have long-standing ways of doing things, ways of delivering services in certain geographic areas, that they've done it the same way for a really long time. I'm thinking a little bit about, libraries as an example. The history of libraries is physical books. Libraries right now in the midst of this crisis are transforming the services and programs they're providing. And whether it's virtual programming, engaging cultural and arts programming that's virtual, access to books and resources and information and online learning, we are seeing some of our library clients just blow it out in terms of adaptability and nimbleness. So you're seeing continuity, but you're also seeing tremendous change. And so one of the things that we're also exploring with clients is when we think about continuity with history, what is staying the same? I think as we're dealing with the crisis as leaders, we're getting a lot of messages that says everything is different, nothing is the same. And what I'm actually trying to have a conversation with you as leaders is what actually is staying the same? What should stay the same for you as you look to the future? So I want you to kind of jump into the chat box, and I want you to think a little bit about the last 6 weeks, and I want you to think a little bit about the next 6 weeks. And I want you to share what are some of the things that are the constants in your organization that even as you've had to work remotely, change program service delivery, what is actually some of the things that are the threads of continuity with who you've been historically? I'd love to hear. Great. So Kim sharing that really the center in continuity is the needs of students. Absolutely. So really centering on who are you serving? How are their needs changing in the crisis? What's important to them right now? I think that is one of the things even that's brought this webinar series together as we've thought about continuity here at FIO is bringing all of you together. Renee's jumping in, the mission statement will remain the same, which is to support families in the inner city. Again, anchoring on client service, empowering students to succeed, just doing it differently. I love it. Connecting people with the importance of place and using humanities programming to do so. That's Brett. Thanks, Brent. The needs of the communities are still all there and even just heightened. Thank you for sharing that. I mean, I think there's a thread here in what you're sharing, which is that leaning into your mission, leaning into solving the problems of those that you care most about is one of the most powerful threads that can carry you through this crisis. So responding to volunteers and students individually, helping out, using our network. This is about being the problem solver for so many of you, for the clients that you serve. The needs of parents who are trying to work while homeschooling their children. My heart goes out to all of us. That's it. I'm just going to leave that there. Thank you for that, Claire. I mean, this is very difficult for those of us that are trying to work and also homeschool our children. Stronger together, even being more caring, compassionate, and committed. Wonderful. Again, the sort of language of values now matters more as we look to the future and can get through this crisis together. Thanks so much for that, Dawn. And so one of the things we have to begin to realize is that what we aim to do, our mission, serving our clients, has not changed. The environment's changed around us. There's crisis all around us. We're working in new and different ways, but that core purpose really hasn't changed. I'm going to comment a couple of the other great comments. So supporting business success, still important today. The mission of bringing health, hope, and healing, absolutely. Legs for Literacy is a large running event and a vehicle to support an active community living. Great. I mean, these are the pieces and parts that you are going to lean into consistently as you go through this process. And so now I want you to shift a little bit with me though, and begin to think about what could change. What parts of your work have to be more adaptable, more nimble? What could you have to let go of as we look to the future? What are some of the things that we're already saying, well, that's going to stay the same, but that might actually really need to be different. That really might need to evolve as we think to the future. Where are we already seeing our own comfort with that nimbleness and adaptability? I think one of the things I've been incredibly impressed by is our educational clients who have in so many ways transformed on a dime to meet the needs of their students. Even our local school system, I would say, has been really amazing at recognizing that the means at which that we do something needed to completely transform for the new environment and how fast that had to happen and how fast people moved. I've also seen a lot of clients let go of systems, ways we used to do things. We have a couple of clients that in some ways, still were using paper for specific systems. And this is that, well, there's no paper because we're not in the same place. So literally systems that people were really wedded to have really changed really quickly. More remote work versus meeting customers in person. These are great models of services that need to be changed and adapted.
Embracing technology from Benton at the top.
Yep, embracing technology.
Number of families able to serve.
Yeah. And Renee, my sense is that's a smaller number of families able to serve at one time. Great. Flexibility in student learning styles. You know, we can't expect volunteers will be allowed into the schools, so some won't feel safe and will need to open to online options. Great. Re-envisioning main service offerings, since a sport event won't be allowed till 2021. I have to say, Carol, I'm seeing quite a few virtual marathons, which are very cool, that we can all run alone, and then it all adds up to 26 miles. Volunteers in schools, I think we might need to connect Melissa with Lisa. Volunteers in schools is going to be really challenging. I think volunteers overall is going to be very challenging. Our libraries, we have a number of human service providers that use volunteers, really thinking about what does that trajectory look like in the future. Understanding limitations and the ability to say no. Thank you for that, Benton.
Engaging supporters.
We can't identify opportunities for partnerships. Yeah, really challenging in terms of thinking about opportunities for partnerships and events and conferences. I think our whole idea of community convening is going to continue to transform over the next 6 months as our inability to come together remains difficult. I think for at least, people are talking at least 6 to 9 months, I think, until we get back to kind of like very, very large scale events. And so there really are some substantive implications for nonprofits, for theaters, for our arts organizations, as it relates to some of that. So for some of our clients, it's a complete and total business model disruption, and having to let go of really some of the more traditional elements of really what the work looked and felt like. And I'll just sort of pause right there to say, this conversation about what we can let go of will also have a lot of emotional content with it. So I just want you as leaders to think about, you know, that the losses here for you as leaders, for your volunteers, for your board members really can't be understated. And so as you engage in these discussions, you know, people really may get very emotional. And so just preparing yourself for that, you know, you've probably been thinking about it sooner and earlier than anyone else, which means when they hear about it, it's going to be for the first time. So you really may need to kind of manage people's emotions through this process. Claire's jumping in, you know, working with parents and educators to prioritize the needs of students for academic support, looking ahead. Absolutely. Absolutely. So when we're thinking about the core, you know, this really is this sort of trifecta of thinking. And so what we want to be thinking about, and why is the core so helpful in defining? And again, I think this is an incredible exercise to go through, is that it really helps us as leaders to really determine which are the issues that are really worth fighting for. Which are the issues that in some ways you are going to say, yeah, that's a deal breaker for us. We're not going to give up on that. We're going to stick to that as we look ahead. Or that's a thread of one of our values, or a piece of our mission that we are really dedicating to protecting, even if we're smaller in size, even if we're delivering our services in a new or different way. It also should help you think a little bit about staff competencies that you want to make sure that you retain, or even staff competencies that you need to recruit for. You know, part of this is many of you have had to deal with difficult decisions already relating to furloughing staff. But I do think as you look to the future, there may be specific staff members that you really do want to make sure that you retain them and bring them back to help you do some of this thinking for the future. Do you need to be thinking about program consolidation, combination, or reinvention? And the key here is to be doing your best to think about what are the resources that are going to be available in the future, and can you in fact design a viable version of yourself that may need to be smaller? And that's really the question. And so there's the bit of this hedgehog approach, which is really the combination of these three things. Can your new core access your passion, which is really your mission, your purpose? Can it leverage where you have the most competence, where you are really good at it? You know, these are the programs and services that you're like, actually, we are way better than the next guy. We should not give up this work. We should not give up this model. And then the last piece of it is the availability of resources. This is the sweet spot of a powerful core that can really be resilient in these very challenging, uncertain times. That is what you're looking to try to define in so many ways to survive this and really thrive on the other side. But this does require us to have some of those different conversations that say, you know what, that was a program that we ran and it was mediocre at best, and we didn't do a good job of it. That's one that we can actually admit and let it go, and let whatever sort of implications of that unfold, whether it's that the clients that you serve, you can transition to them, to the better player up the street. You've got to make sure that your mission and your way of operating can continue into the future. And this is the conversation in so many ways that I really want you to have, and I don't want you to wait to have it. This is not a conversation you should have 3 months from now. This is a conversation ideally that you are potentially already having and should be having as we think about the next 4 to 6 weeks. Okay, so that's what I had for today's session in terms of content. I want to open it up for Q&A and really get people's questions about defining the core, thinking about your future, or even questions that you have as we think about our next session, which is on scenario planning. So happy to answer any questions that people have about the tool, that they have about really anything that I've talked about today, about thinking about retrenchment, you know, being a smaller entity in order to survive and thrive on the other side. Just want to kind of open the space for any questions. You can jump in the chat or feel free to just unmute yourself. I guess I would ask a question to the group, which also is, you may not have a question for me, but I'm curious to sort of see if this resonates with you as a group, this kind of thinking about a thoughtful, objective financial assessment combined with deeply looking at your programs and services. I'm sure this may be something each of you may be doing already, but I'm curious if this approach or kind of way of thinking about this is helpful to you. Okay. I'm going to go over to Laura and sort of see, Laura, what do you think? Should we open it up, and how should we proceed?
Would you know, I think these conversations always take one brave person to kind of step up and share a bit of their journey. So if any of our clients who we've been working with would love to hear from you, if there's something that you've been working on already that you can share with the team, or something, that one particular thing out of what Anne shared that particularly strikes you, whether it's something that's useful or even maybe not so useful. So
yeah. Carol, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I was going to say that our organization, luckily or not, enough, actually went through major soul searching last year. And so to have to do this now is actually, I think, part of what got me thinking, like when you were speaking, is that we actually finally have the right people around the table to deal with these questions. And I think as leaders, an important thing to think about is that core team you have around you that supports you through normal times and growth stages and all that stuff. Some people just, it may not be within their scope of capacity to think about these things. And so I think that's an important piece of the pie. Like we went through slow change in terms of how we were going to make our service offering and engage volunteers and take it, and actually started to grow by engaging staff. But that was an evolution of about 2 or 3 years of shifting people on the board who had a mentality of, oh, we'll just get it done, to no, we can't do this like this anymore. So I think there's at least an awareness of who you have around the table, and how to weigh their input on these kinds of questions is important.
Oh, you're muted, Anne.
Oh, that's great, Carol. Thank you. I really do think that it's about getting the right people around the table that are really ready to do that thinking.
Anyone else have thoughts? I'd be interested, based on what Carol said, anybody have somebody who they are kind of relying on as their sounding board or their muse? Who are you looking to that's providing you that guidance and feedback?
Yeah, I have to say we had a great conversation about this on Tuesday, about the people, to Carol, your exact point, the people that we talk to during the normal times are not the people that we need to talk to when we have to blow something up and rebuild it. Really,
Yeah.
really personalities.
And I would also say that, and I was not paid for this, but we actually used several consultants up here in Canada who helped us through it, and each of them had different strengths. We had some to actually guide us through the discussion, some to help us through the execution. And again, those consultants brought different strengths to the table, and we were lucky to get the right ones at the right time.
Awesome.
So I think looking outside the organization, particularly if you're not an organization that has recently gone through change like we have, would be extremely valuable.
Right. I appreciate the plug, Carol. No, I'm kidding. No, but really, I do think we really do see that some of these decisions and conversations are very difficult. And really the ability to bring stakeholders along in your thinking. So I really do think many of you are farther ahead than your board members, than your senior staff even maybe. And so really thinking through, how do you bring people along into these conversations that may be difficult? You know, you may have specific staff or specific board who are like, no, that program or service cannot go away. It's a really tough conversation that says we just cannot run it anymore, and here's why. So that's really powerful. Does anybody else want to jump in? Okay. All right. So Laura, what do you think that we should head over to happy hour?
Yes, I think for those of you, we had a nice intimate group last time. We'd love to encourage more of you. It's really just even more informal conversation, and everybody unmuted and chipping in. We understand some of you probably have other obligations, but hope you'll take advantage of the opportunity to just have more conversation really with each other, and you know, build some of that community engagement. Maybe have a beverage of choice if you are so inclined. And if not, we absolutely thank you for engaging with us and taking your time. We know, especially now, how precious your time is, and hope you found value. Would love to hear any feedback, positive or constructive, about whether this and the last session were helpful to you. So please reach out to any of us, and we hope you'll come back again on Tuesday.
Yeah, so up next Tuesday is scenario planning. So we are going to be talking about, today we talked about really trying to understand you and where you are as an organization, and we're going to jump over to really understanding and strategies to understand our environment on Tuesday. And so this is really thinking through what are the questions we should be asking, and then how do we actually build out strong scenarios to really get comfortable with the unknown. So excited to do that with you. And I'll just echo Laura, our little happy hour is hilarious. So if you would like to stay for what becomes the webinar after party, you are welcome to. We'd love to see you, and look forward to continuing to work with you over these sessions. We're just excited to kind of have the chance to be together as a group. So thanks so much for the time today, and we'll do the stop share, and we'll hang out for those that would like to sort of sit and chat with us.